Thanks. Hi, everyone. So as Ronan said, I run the Lustre engineering team at Intel, but this talk is given in my capacity as one of the co-leads of the Lustre working group. So the Lustre working group has existed in various guises since 2011 as the Lustre team left Oracle. And it's basically a forum to discuss, organize, coordinate efforts of anything relating to the Lustre community releases. So we do, as well as myself, there's also other regular people who are involved in the meetings, Andreas from Intel and Corey and Patrick from Cray and Olaf from HB, all regulars on the calls. We have, so you can chat to any of us about what we get up to. We have the calls every couple of weeks, and we do keep minutes on the wiki for those who are unable to attend. Certainly the calls are not scheduled at really Europe or Asia-friendly times. Going on to, one of the things that we get involved with is the annual OpenSFS Lustre survey. So you've probably seen the emails go out around this on the mailing list. So just to reassure you, if you answer this survey, you do not get bombarded with spam. It's, there's nothing, no email address is supplied. It's, exclusively for us to just gather information to help make more informed decisions about, what people are doing with Lustre today, what they need, what they want to do with it in the future. So I did present in a bit more detail about this at LUG, and there's a full written report on the wiki if you're really interested. But for me, that's the question that is most interesting is the one about Lustre versions that are being used in production. So if you see here, the data on the left, the blue lines is last year's data, and the red lines are this year's data. So even though this is now over 6 months old, I still think it predated the 2.10 release being out. I think there's two obvious things that jump out here. One is that 2.5 is still the most commonly used release in production, so that's no great surprise. This was widely adopted by the vendors and did have multiple releases, and it was a good solid release. So a lot of deployments out there on 2.5. But also we're seeing, continuing to see the newer Lustre releases get picked up. So to me, I think this, is two positives around this. It means that we're continuing to add new capabilities to Lustre that people want to use. And also, I think it's a testimony to the strides we've made in recent years with Lustre quality. People feel like even, at this point, with not having, the safety net of maintenance releases, still that feeling confident that this is something we can use in production. So, with Lustre 2.10, there have been some, positive changes in this regard. So, as we started on the release cycle for 2.10, it was, just seemed to be, a routine community release, and then with changes in Intel to refocus our Lustre, all our Lustre efforts on the community releases, and then the new concept of the long-term stable releases, which I'll elaborate on a bit more later on. This has obviously put a lot more focus and interest on this release, as people, knowing that there will be a series of maintenance releases available for this. So I expect to see this release widely adopted. So the release came out in July, and there was, it was pretty packed actually with content. So I'll skip over the first two because I have dedicated slides, but Project Quotas is work that was done by DDN. So this was a pretty, huge, long effort. It involved working with the upstream ext4 community and getting changes put in the Linux kernel that then could be leveraged by Lustre. So that's available now in 2.10. We did sort of try and engage Red Hat to see if the necessary patches could be incorporated into a Red Hat minor release, and they initially were somewhat open to the idea, but unfortunately in the end they concluded that that's not something they'll do. So although I know the Project Quotas is something that many people are very interested in, I was talking to Roland and Frederick from Kit and Diamond yesterday about that, and that was something they very much could see a real benefit to using over the kind of quotas, user and group quotas. And but you will have to make a choice between patching your kernel if you want to use that, unfortunately. And as we've made strides with our eliminating kernel patches, that is a bit of a decision for some. NRS delay policy is really a testing feature just to be able to test, simulate server load for in a test thing before going into production. ZFS snapshots is using for Lustre on ZFS deployments, being able to leverage the ZFS capability to take snapshots. So for backup purposes, to have a whole consistent backup of the Lustre file system you can revert to if need be. And then some other useful things, Andreas is talking tomorrow about overall about Lustre on ZFS, so he'll elaborate on this. But ZFS metadata improvements, there's some work that was done on the Lustre side, as well as work that's gone into ZFS, which the Lustre side of it was in 2.10. Of all people using Omnipath, again, there was performance improvements, which will get more consistent and high performance from that. And we did include the pacemaker scripts that we've been using in the field at Intel, with a view to just get consistency across the community and reduce the amount of everyone having to reinvent the wheel. So progressive file layout. So this was a collaboration between Intel and Oak Ridge National Labs. And this makes things simpler for the administrator by allowing to be able to specify for different size as files grow in size that the striping will adjust to be able to be the most performant choice. So it takes the decision making out of the hands of the end user, and so you can get the right decision made without too much hassle. Multi-rail LNet. This was a collaboration. It started off between Intel and SGI, and then as SGI joined HPE, the work completed there. And so there is still ongoing work there. And Olaf from HPE is here. He's been instrumental in that work, and he presented on this topic last year. But just overall, it allows using multiple network interfaces to aggregate their performance. Looking at who's involved in the 2.10 releases, so there's the usual array of the vendors and the large sort of DOE sites who historically been involved with Lustre, but there's also some less common names that pop up in these sort of charts here. So that this data on the left is the number of commits of changes going in, and this is the lines of code, actual lines of code change. So it's the same data, but just shown in different ways. And then, but there are a couple of less familiar names here, which I always like to sort of highlight when people are getting involved. So there's the University of Hamburg and in Germany, and the University of Swinburne in Australia, who both had some involvement in the 2.10 release. And a key part of our quality process is the peer review process. So any change that goes into Lustre has to be signed off by at least 2 engineers who are familiar with that area of code. So it, so basically from the initial proposal of a change, that there's multiple iterations before we actually settle upon the final version that goes in. And so this takes, a lot of the effort that goes into the releases is in this area, in the review form. And so, again, the usual suspects here, but that doesn't sound good. But also Stanford University, who are, a less common name to see in these kind of charts were involved. So just to flag that. Seeing how 2.10 compares to earlier releases, many people, consider the amount of change as a sort of measure of the degree of risk around picking up a new release. So, it's not always the case. Sometimes, removing a bunch of dead code that wasn't being used anyway would still, bump these numbers without, any additional risk. But, it is certainly one thing to look at. Certainly 2.10 seems, fairly similar in terms of the number of commits to 2.9 and the amount of code change to 2.5, both, fairly modest releases. So, despite the large amount of, capabilities added, it's not been a a huge amount of change in terms, of churn to the code base. Whereas if you compare it to sort of one of the really large releases like 2.4, which did have, a great deal of, structural changes in that release. So I said I would elaborate about the LTS releases. So, this kind of concept isn't unfamiliar to open source projects. It's, while there's some people who are very keen to immediately adopt the latest and greatest features, some people prefer to forego those for something a bit more proven. And so, we did do something somewhat similar to this back in the WAM Cloud time, where we had the concept of maintenance release streams. But we basically learned from a couple of things that didn't go so well there, and we've adjusted things, as a result. So back at WAM Cloud, we announced way ahead of time the scheduling of all the maintenance releases. So we had 2.1 as a maintenance release stream, and we announced, for the next 18 months, we're going to do 1 a quarter. And what we found was that by the time we got to 2.1.5 and 2.1.6, people weren't bothering to move to the new releases. So we were putting all the work into doing the releases, and we were getting diminishing returns on the benefit from that. And as a result, we had less capacity to do other things people were hoping we might do, in terms of maybe we could have done a 2.2 maintenance release or something. So what we're intending to do now is to just we'll do the releases. There will be they will come out fairly often just naturally, but we'll do them when there's a driver to make it worthwhile doing one. So if there's a new version of Red Hat comes out or something, we'll do a release to accommodate that, right? Things like that. If there's we find a few bugs in a certain area of code, again that would be a useful trigger to do one. So we've just got the 2.10.1 release just out, and we will do another 2.10.2 before the end of the year, but that's about as far ahead as we're predicting at the moment. Then another aspect is, this should give us a bit more flexibility to be able to do maintenance releases on, releases which are not LTS releases. So, the 2.11 release is the major community release we're working on at the moment, and that's due out in the new year, and we may well do a 2.11 once, for example, if people are adopting that release and there's some driver to do that. But once 2.12 is out, we wouldn't do a 2.11 maintenance release. We would encourage people to move to either 2.12 or 2.12.1 or whatever it is, but just to consolidate the cutting edge releases from the LTS releases. Obviously it makes sense. We have a limited resources at our disposal as a community. It doesn't make sense to try and take on too much. We'd rather focus on less things and do those well. So I did let the cat out of the bag somewhat, but since I submitted these slides we've actually had some changes here. So I'm glad to say that as of yesterday, 2.10.1 is GA, not just approaching GA. So normally, maintenance releases are fairly routine and don't get too much attention, but this particular release is noteworthy not just as a landmark of being our first LTS release, but it just also the way things aligned is actually delivering quite a lot of value. So we have the Red Hat 7.4 support, and also there's ZFS 0.7.1 support. So for those running Lustre on ZFS, Lustre, ZFS 0.7x is really a big jump from 0.6x. So again, Andreas is going to talk more about that tomorrow, but that's definitely something people are waiting for. And then usually, support for Mellanox OFED is just a given, doesn't really even pass comment. We've had some issues this year. From the beginning of the year, Mellanox made some big changes around their releases with MoFed 4.0, and we actually had some interruption in our ability to support MoFed. So finally, with 2.10.1, I believe that those issues are all rectified, and it should be possible to run with the latest MoFed 4.1 release. And then we've also, ongoing support for newer kernels. With the 4.9 kernel, we got to that level with everything landed needed. And we've also been expanding the test matrix to add more Linux distributions, so RHEL 6.9 and Ubuntu 16.04 clients were added there. And then we do, still there's more things that are ongoing, and maybe in 2.10.2 or subsequent releases, we've got some work that was work in progress to improve single thread performance, and that's a big deal for, well, I know it's certainly a big deal for Xeon Phi, but there's other use cases as well where that's important. And also, SLED servers as well is something that people often ask us about, and it's something we're aiming to add at some point in the future. So 2.11 is work in development at the moment, due out early in the new year. We've finally landed, Patrick from Cray, his work for Lock Ahead finally landed, I'm glad to say. And we've still got some work that's actively going on for data on MTT, which does, small file I/O performance improvements, and FLR as well. The first stage of that is in the frame to, hopefully land for 2.11. Here's the latest version of the roadmap. So again, this is something that we keep up to date in the LWG, periodically update, and we'll be doing an update of this in the coming weeks ahead of supercomputing. But this is the version there at the moment. And so one thing I traditionally haven't really spoken about is IML, but since the changes some months back, one of the changes that was made was that IML, which had formerly been a first WAN cloud, then Intel proprietary software, was open sourced. So IML is a GUI which is used to manage and monitor Lustre file systems. And again, there's a change since I submitted this slide. So as of a few hours ago, the first release candidate was cut for IML 4.0, which it was in a holding pattern waiting for 2.10.1 to go out because it's going to be based on that release. So this initial 4.0 release is basically just equivalent to the Enterprise Edition 3.1 version in terms of functionality, with the changes being that it's now distributed differently open source, which was a much more work than you would expect to change that over, and also switching from a 2.7 based release to a 2.10 based, a 2.10.1 based release. So we do have hundreds of sites in production at the moment running the older versions of IML. So it's possible for those sites to upgrade to this release if they want. They're not obliged to, but that's an option. And then the other interesting thing is that with the way this changed, instead of with the Intel branded releases, these were like monolithic releases spanning all the different components, including IML and Lustre, and now that's decoupled, and so IML will have its own release cadence and can actually do subsequent releases more quickly now as we've over this initial hurdle. So going on, yes, so forward after this initial release, we're planning to do another release early in the new year. We do have some initial thinking around content for that, but we would really like to get some input from the community about what the priority should be around that release. So we really want to make this a community developed project like Lustre, and to make it useful to a broad, get broadest adoption as we can for this project. So we definitely have plans around IML where it's going to be used in some large-scale deployments. So part of our thinking at the moment is changes which will improve the performance around much larger deployments than we had traditionally seen with IML. We also want to make IML more modular, so it's easier just to use certain aspects of it with not having to use the whole thing in your entirety. So perhaps people who do have some, maybe vendors who have their own offering will be able to leverage some of the functionality, but still retain their own capability. So the more we can consolidate efforts and get consistency and not be reinventing the wheel, the more we can collectively get done. And also Z, so the ZFS event daemon, again, Andreas is giving a talk more elaborating about this tomorrow, but this is something that we think has a lot of potential for things we can do, beyond the obvious, more stuff to report out on. There's also, we think we can leverage this to be able to, in our file system discovery steps around IML. Always like to give a plug for documentation. So those of you who actually use Lustre and are using these documents are in the best place to spot when there's gaps or errors in the documentation. So, you know, I know it's frustrating if that happens, but, you know, please, you know, do help to report the issues. So I appreciate that not everyone has the time to go in and work out how you actually can correct these things. But if you at least report it, we're aware and we can do something. That we have a huge body of documentation out there, and to keep on top of it is, you know, an impossible task. But you know, if you do spot something, let us know, and we'll do what we can to get it back, you know, get it fixed. So just to summarize, so 2.10.1 is now out. 2.10.2 should be out in the next couple of months. We are working actively on 2.11, and so we should know, you know, shortly what the final content of that is going to be. IML 4.0 is very close to being available, and you know, we're looking for input about 4.1 and what we should be including in that. And there's no shortage of options for people who are keen to contribute to Lustre and or IML. Okay, that's what I had. So, any questions either now or?
Question for Peter?
Peter, is any design documents for LNet Health Network is shared for community? Or a ticket or some brief descriptions, how it works?
The health network?
Yes.
Olaf, is Olaf here? Yeah, I just remember the one.
Can you share?
Basically, we are still working on that feature. Design documents for that will become available once they are far enough advanced.
I will be happy to review this document and contact to development.
I will keep that in mind, talk it through with Amir, who's working with on that, and we will get you into the loop. Thank you.
Yeah.
This is going back a bit in your presentation, but I noticed that 2.9 had 120 developers, which is 50% more than any other release. Do you have any idea why?
Yes. So I think that was fallout from our partnership with Seagate. So there was a backlog of small, relatively uninteresting changes that we expedited landing as part of that relationship, whereas as a general, are they important to the release and the community? No, but.
And a bunch of similar upstream kernel patches that James Simmons supported as well.
No, because those ones don't count in the numbers. So those, when it's on those charts where it says other, like, so this is Chris Morone wrote the scripts originally, and Dustin Leverman updates them. So basically, all of those contributions are actually people who are actively working on Lustre and know they're working on Lustre, and not just drive-by kernel, people who do something on the staging area of the Lustre client. Those are tracked separately. So the actual number of contributions is much higher than is being shown there, but that's people who really are working on Lustre.
I've got a question. Do you know if support for Mofed 4.1 means that support of Mofed 3 has been dropped?
Oh no, because everyone's been using that because they haven't been able to use Mofed 4 reliably. So yeah, we don't,
So both should be supported with 2.10?
Both should work, yeah. It's just that usually Melnox tell everyone to move to the latest release, and then they haven't been able to.
No more question? Okay.
Okay.
Thank you,
And I'm happy to take questions. Come just chat on a break if you want.